The history of Thanksgiving, as traditionally taught, often focuses on the peaceful feast shared between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people in 1621. However, the true history of Thanksgiving is far more complex and includes darker elements tied to the legacy of colonialism, the treatment of indigenous peoples, and the cultural shifts over the centuries. Let's break down the key aspects of this darker history, focusing on facts. The widely accepted narrative is that the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag tribe came together in 1621 to celebrate a harmonious feast. However, the reality is more nuanced. While there was indeed a shared meal between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag, it wasn't a formal Thanksgiving in the way we think of it today. This event was a harvest feast, a practice that indigenous peoples had been observing long before the Pilgrims arrived. The Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower in 1620 were seeking religious freedom, but they also sought land and resources. This desire for land quickly led to tensions with local indigenous populations, including the Wampanoag, who initially saw the Pilgrims as potential allies in their struggle against rival tribes. Initial relations. In 1620, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, decided to form an alliance with the Pilgrims to protect their territory against the Narragansett and Pequot tribes. This alliance was initially based on mutual survival rather than a shared ideology or culture.
While the Feast of 1621 is often remembered as a symbol of cooperation, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag quickly deteriorated. As the Pilgrims expanded their settlements, they began encroaching on Wampanoag land. We were eventually forced to give up more and more land to European settlers, which disrupted our way of life.
The Wampanoag, like many other indigenous groups, suffered greatly from diseases brought by Europeans, such as smallpox and measles. These diseases decimated indigenous populations, including the Wampanoag, whose numbers were drastically reduced from pre-contact estimates of around 40,000 to only about 5,000 by the 1670s. These diseases, coupled with land loss and violence, led to the collapse of Wampanoag society. King Philip's War, which took place from 1675 to 1676, is often glossed over in the Thanksgiving myth. This war was a direct result of the ever-expanding English colonies and their demand for more land. Named after Massasoit's son, Metacom, also known as King Philip, the war began when the English colonists began encroaching further on native lands and imposing Christian conversion efforts on indigenous peoples. The Wampanoag and other native groups united under Metacom's leadership in response. The war was devastating, with thousands of lives lost on both sides. After the English victory, native resistance was brutally crushed, and Metacom was killed, his body dismembered, and his head displayed publicly in Plymouth for decades. Following the war, many indigenous peoples were killed, enslaved, or displaced. Their lands were seized, and many were pushed further westward, marking a turning point in the relationship between Native Americans and European settlers. The violence continued as European settlers expanded their colonies across North America. The creation of Thanksgiving as a national holiday. While Thanksgiving was celebrated in various forms throughout early American history, it was not until the 19th century that it became an official national holiday. In 1863, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday, partly as a way to unify the country. At this point, the idea of Thanksgiving as a national day of gratitude took hold, and the Pilgrim myth began to take on a more positive, nationalistic tone. As Thanksgiving became more ingrained in American culture, the narrative shifted to one of harmony between Pilgrims and Native Americans. This portrayal was tied to the idea of American exceptionalism and the civilizing mission of European settlers, which often ignored the violent history of colonization and its ongoing impacts on indigenous peoples. For many indigenous communities, Thanksgiving is not a day of celebration but a reminder of centuries of displacement, violence, and cultural erasure. Groups such as the National Day of Mourning in Plymouth, Massachusetts, hold annual gatherings on Thanksgiving to honor their ancestors and raise awareness of indigenous struggles. This has become an important counter-narrative where Native peoples reclaim the story and emphasize the need for acknowledgement and reconciliation. The concept of manifest destiny. The 19th century saw the rise of the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's divine right to expand westward across the continent. This belief justified the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands, the destruction of their cultures, and the near extermination of entire tribes. One of the most tragic results of manifest destiny was the forced relocation of Native American tribes, notably the Cherokee Nation, during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Thousands of Cherokee people were forcibly removed from their homes in the southeastern U.S. and relocated to reservations in the West, where many died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Land and sovereignty issues. Today, many indigenous communities still struggle with issues of land rights, sovereignty, and recognition. Colonization has left a lasting legacy in the form of broken treaties, the destruction of sacred sites, and the ongoing fight for reparations and land restitution.
Despite centuries of oppression, indigenous peoples across the U.S. have maintained their cultures, languages, and traditions. In recent years, there has been a resurgence in efforts to preserve indigenous cultures, reclaim sacred lands, and demand justice for the historical wrongs committed against their peoples.
The traditional story of Thanksgiving often leaves out the darker aspects of colonialism, indigenous displacement, and the violence faced by Native Americans. Recognizing the history behind Thanksgiving, from the early Pilgrim Wampanoag interactions to the brutal aftermath of colonization, is essential to understanding the full picture of American history.
Many indigenous peoples now use Thanksgiving as a time to reflect on their history and assert their rights to land, recognition, and cultural survival. Acknowledging the darker history of Thanksgiving is a step toward reconciliation and honoring the resilience of indigenous peoples.
In summary, the Thanksgiving myth, with its image of peace and cooperation, masks a far more complicated and tragic reality. By examining the true history, including the violent conflicts, the broken promises, and the ongoing impact of colonization, we can gain a deeper understanding of the holiday's origins and its significance today. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below.